notion that biology is highly dichotomized, is highly binary. It comes as either Coke or Pepsi, yes or no, chocolate, vanilla, whatever binary things I could come up with. And biological systems, sexual differentiation turns out to be much more of a continuum than a binary than people used to think. People used to think there's a clear lock and step sequence by which the biology, the binary biology of sexual differentiation is locked in, which generates the next binary, the next, and the next, as follows. The first starting point is the binary nature of sex chromosomes. Your XX or your XY. You got two X's, you're female, XY, you're male, and that's all there is. And that then determines the binary nature of your gonads. Are they ovaries or testes? Which then determines the binary nature of what gonadal hormones you are secreting. Estrogen, progesterone, or testosterone, which will then determine the binary nature of your genitals and whether you have a vagina, clitoris, male penis, scrotum, where the gonads are, and then secondary sexual, and a clear dichotomized pathway. And what the biological advances have been about is seeing that none of those steps are always clearly dichotomized, always clearly binary. Chromosomal level, you're either XX or you're XY. Turns out there's all sorts of other variations, XYY, single X, triple X, endless variations on that. They're all quite rare, but nonetheless, chromosomally, the sexes do not come in just two absolute dichotomized flavors. Next level, ditto for your gonads. There's all sorts of disorders. There's all sorts of circumstances, rare ones, where you will get somebody whose gonads are a mosaic, a chimera of a mixture of ovarian cells and testicular cells. Something called ovotesticular disorder. There's a number of related ones. So it's not always one or the other. Hormones, it's not always one or the other. Males secrete a certain degree of female typical steroid hormones. Females secrete considerable amounts of testosterone related hormones out of their adrenal glands. That's not clearly dichotomized either. Next step up, at the level of the genitals, and it turns out that's not so clean either. And a remarkable finding, a substantial subset of people with great frequency are born with sexually ambiguous genitalia, where it's not quite clear if we're looking at a boy or a girl. And this is really more common than one would think. It is often corrected with reconstructive surgery, and there's a horrendous history of sort of abuses that has taken in some sort of tragic individual cases. But the main thing is that's not even cleanly dichotomized. You can have a phallus that's kind of intermediate between an engorged clitoris and a penis and a dead end vaginal opening and all sorts of stuff. Like, how common is any of this? The chromosomal exceptions to the binary are pretty rare. The gonadal are quite rare. The endocrine, there's massive overlap. The genital, one of the leaders in the field, and Fausto Sterling at Brown University, in this one very influential review in the field, estimates something like 1% to 2% of people are born with sexually ambiguous genitals. Think about that, 1% to 2%. You walk through your town square, and the person you pass is more likely statistically to have been born in some intersexual state than they are to have an IQ over 150. So what we're seeing is this lock and step. It's binary and dichotomized, and this determines that you can get dissociations at every one of these levels, which of course brings us to the brain. And people were blown away in the 70s, starting there, by the discovery that there were structural differences in the brain depending on your sex. Ooh, the sexually dimorphic brain, different shapes, different sizes, different parts since then, different neurotransmitter concentrations, different everything. Ooh, everyone shouted there is a male brain and a female brain. And that completely distortive false dichotomy has dominated the field ever since. Yeah, statistically, on the average, this little sub area of the hypothalamus tends to be bigger in this sex than in the other one. Whether you're looking at a lab rat or a monkey or a human or whatever, there's a whole array. There's like dozens of different sexually dimorphic regions in the brain, where on the average, there is a difference in the size and the function of the whatever. First thing that comes out of that, woo, how big are these differences? Are they big enough? Are they dramatic enough? Are they consistent enough that you could look at one sub area of the brain, the hot spot? One of these is called the bed nucleus of the striae terminalis, and look at it under a microscope and know the sex of the individual who it came from? Not a chance. These are distributions that are very heavily overlapping. You cannot sex a human by knowing the size, receptor levels, anything about a particular part of the brain. Next caveat against the enthusiasm that there is a male brain or a female brain. So you would say, okay, so at least in this part of the brain, this is an individual who's pretty strongly in the female direction, for example, in terms of its size, its shape, its smell, its flavor, whatever. And thus, presumably, it's somewhat on the female side in the 12 other parts of the brain that are statistically sexually dimorphic. And you look at it and no, that's not the case. There's a mosaicism. It's a rare person where all of the sexually dimorphic parts of their brain are dimorphic in the same direction. Instead, there's all sorts of variability with that. Okay, so that's our backdrop for now saying, whoa, so what's up with people who say this is not really what my sex is? This is not the sex I identify with. It's the other one. What's up with them? And Medicine Forever had a very clear answer, which is for some weirdo reason, given this person's chromosomes and gonads and hormones and genitals and secondary sexual characteristics and everything, for some weird reason, they think they're a different sex from what they actually are. And that ushered in the possibility to now look in the brains of cis and trans people with a very simple question. When you look at a trans brain, when you look at those sexually dimorphic regions, are they, for example, in an individual who was born male but says they have never felt male? Do their brain regions that are sexually dimorphic look more like your textbook male region or female region? And the first work of this was done by a neuroanatomist named Dick Swab in the Netherlands, who's amazingly accomplished scientist. And he first published extremely thorough studies showing basically you get somebody who chromosomally, gonadally, et cetera, is, for example, female. And they say, you know what? I don't care. My entire life I have felt male. You look at the sexually dimorphic parts of their brain, and it's closer to the male average than the female average. Or you look at someone who's male, who said, I've always felt female, same thing. And landmark study of looking at this, oh, wait a second, there's a confound. Lots of people who undergo sex changes, there's surgical stuff, there's hormonal stuff, and you're suddenly taking hormones of the stereotypical opposite sex. And is that, no, you even look at people before they transition, before they take any of the hormones. And the first reports came in showing you got someone who says, I may be female in all these ways, but I've always felt male for as long as I could remember. You look at the dimorphic parts of the brain, and they more resemble your typical male brain than your female. In the years since then, that's become sort of a cottage industry. A lot of studies that have been done since then, not just the size and structure of different brain regions, not just the neurochemical makeup, but the level of activity in this or that brain region when you're doing functional brains. There's a whole world by now of people looking at, so what's up with people who are seemingly this sex by all of those biological criteria, but say that nonetheless they have always felt like they are the opposite. The finding is softened a little bit since Schwab's initial studies. And probably the safest thing to say at this point is if you have someone who, despite their chromosomes, etc., they're supposed to be one sex, say, I feel like the other, you look in their brain and it is not particularly like the brain of the sex that everyone would expect it to be. It is not structurally a brain that is in close agreement with the chromosomes, the gonads, et cetera, et cetera. It's not as far in the other direction as those first studies suggested, but mainly the point is if you have someone who says, I don't care what my chromosomes, gonads, etc., and so on say. I don't care if they all collectively say, I am this sex. I have never identified with that sex. I have never felt that way. You look in the brain, and the neurobiology supports this. So what does this suggest at the end? I have this like silly bias that if you got to choose between like the nature of somebody's gonads and the nature of their brain and trying to make sense of what sort of person they are, I'd listen to how the brain is voting every time. What this begins to suggest is rather than the old model, for some reason, this person who is of sex number one, for some reason, they think they're actually sex number two. What I think is much more accurate is for some reason, this person who is sex number two had incredibly bad screwy luck and got handed the body of someone with sex number one. I think that is closer to a description of what's happening, which is if at every level you can dissociate the chromosomal story from the gonadal, from the endocrine, all of that, that if you have a dissociation, everything in agreement up to the level of the brain, what the brain is saying is going to be far more worth listening to, in my view. And that's much more a picture of someone who got stuck with the wrong kind of body rather than somebody who, for some reason, isn't comfortable with the sex that they are. So that's what's up with trans and cis. That says absolutely nothing about any of the controversies that are scorching our schools and voting booths. And I'm not going near any of that with a 10-foot pole. Neurobiologically, that's what you wind up seeing. That's the current knowledge of the field.
And on that note, that is it for episode 38.